there is a $1 million question in front-end development that we need an answer for, and that is, which should you use, CSS Grid or Flexbox? So welcome to the Code Lab channel, guys, and in this video we're going to be diving deep into the two layout kings of front-end development, Flexbox and CSS Grid, and figuring out which one we should use and whether we should use both. But before we get started, guys, if you are new here and are interested in learning programming, please subscribe to the Code Lab channel as I post weekly tutorials on many different aspects of programming, and make sure you turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Now, as you're probably aware, Flexbox and CSS Grid are the two layout modules that are now giants in mainstream front-end development, and what they do is basically allows us to create complex layouts that previously were only possible by applying CSS hacks or using JavaScript. Now, for whatever reason, there is a bit of a debate and a divide between the two kings. In one corner, you've always got the people who say that you should always use Flexbox, and then in the other corner, you have people who say you should always use CSS Grid. Now, again, as I mentioned, in this video, we're going to be diving deep into this debate and answering which one you should use and whether you should use both. Now, to get to the answer of this $1 million question and end the debate once for all, it's probably best to go over the key differences between the two layouts first, and the key difference lies in their dimensions. And the most important thing to know about Flexbox is that it's one-dimensional, and what Flexbox does is lay out items along either the horizontal or the vertical axes, so you have to decide whether you want a row-based or a column-based layout. Now, a Flex layout can wrap onto multiple rows or columns, but this doesn't necessarily make it two-dimensional because Flexbox treats each row or column as a separate entity based on its content and the available space. Now, the advantages of using Flexbox is that it can be arranged in any direction, its visual order can be reversed or rearranged, the items can be aligned in your container or between them, and it's pretty much supported by all browsers. Now, a disadvantage of Flexbox is that it sometimes runs into performance issues. Now, the CSS Grid layout is a two-dimensional grid-based system with rows and columns, so it gives us the power to work on both the rows and the columns, allowing developers to easily control the rendering and appearance of large-scale layouts and whole pages meant for desktops, tablets, and smartphone displays. Now, one of the biggest advantages of CSS Grid is that it's really useful in creating more complex and organized layouts, and creating and defining these overall layouts remains one of its strongest suits. Now, it also has the advantage of fractional units, which are a very powerful feature that Flexbox doesn't actually have. And what these do is just allow us to not just rely on percentages for widths and heights of columns and rows, and are great because fractional units actually take up whatever space is available. So instead of relying on a calculation of a percentage that isn't as accurate, and let's face it, can actually be more confusing, and is also really good in reducing file size. Now, a disadvantage is browser compatibility is actually less than Flexbox, but this isn't actually on a large scale, and you'll probably unlikely run into this issue of browser compatibility, but it's just important to know that not all browsers do support CSS Grid. Now, of course, we can't just talk about differences. There is a lot of similarities regarding the two layouts, as they are layout modules. Now, the main similarity is alignment and justification. So thanks to Flexbox and CSS Grid, we no longer need to use CSS hacks or JavaScript for layouts, which is just a massive win. And thanks to these properties, we now have the power to stretch our content, match height, vertically and horizontally lay out our content, as well as centering our content. Now, we've also got the order property, which gives you the power to move content around as you see fit or order your content in a particular way. And lastly, we've got gap properties, which wasn't actually something they actually shared in similarity at a time. And in my opinion, the gap property was actually one of the most powerful features of CSS Grid. But up until recently, Flexbox didn't actually have a great way to add space between items. But now there is a flex gap property, which is meant to have the same kind of implementation as the grid gap property. So with all that information out of the way, which one should I use? So a little drum roll, please. And the one you should use is actually use both of them. Now, this may not satisfy some people, but I think the question of which one should you use is a bit too negative in my opinion, because pitting them against each other just isn't something you should really be doing. Of course, in some areas, each module is more convenient than the other, which we will be looking at in a moment, but to pit them against each other is just wrong in my opinion, so it's better to actually use the two in conjunction. So there are a couple of rule of thumbs in regards to using Flexbox and CSS Grid. Right, guys, from the side of VS Code, and the first and most common approach people implement is that if you want to style something on a smaller scale, i.e. for like a nav bar, or in this case a bio card, you use Flexbox, and if you want to style something on a larger scale, you use CSS Grid. So for our example, I've got a bunch of bio cards of different Mortal Kombat characters, and to lay this out, I've used both Flexbox and CSS Grid. So for the images and the content, I've used Flexbox. And then on a larger scale and making this responsive, I've used CSS Grid. Now, the really cool thing about using CSS Grid here for the larger scale is that I've made this responsive using only one line of code. So if I grab the browser here and I start making this bigger, you can see once we get to a certain size, the cards are responsive and it can fit 2 cards on one line. And then if we get even bigger, it can fit 3. And then if we get even bigger, it will fit more, and it will just keep going until it can fit all of them on one line if your screen is big enough. And then again, if we start going smaller, Once we get to a certain threshold, they'll start stacking on top of each other, so it's nice and responsive. And the really cool thing here is that I've done this with only one line of code without any media queries, which may sound crazy at first, but I'll show you guys exactly how to do that with CSS Grid. So the first thing I want to do is just quickly go over the markup. So this is a blank document, and I've opened this up with live server here. So this is what it currently looks like. So in the markup, we've got a div with the class of card container, which has 6 cards. So there's a div with the class of card, and there's 6 of these. Inside each of these, there's an image, which you can see here. And then underneath that, we have a div with the class of mkinfo, which basically just has a h2, a paragraph, a h3, and some dummy text inside some paragraph tags. So really basic stuff, really. And then if we go inside this style sheet, you can see I've got some global styles. So we've got no margin or padding. The box sizing is set to border box, and our HTML has that linear gradient. So we've got 2 colors here, same as the original. And then the font family is just Arial. So the first thing I'm going to do here is just make sure all of my images are the same size. So I'm going to grab the class of card, go inside the class of card and grab the image tag. And then I'm just going to set a width of this to be 100%. Make sure the height of this is 400 pixels, so the images now will be the exact same width and height. Now if we look at some of the images, you can see they're quite stretched and completely lose their aspect ratio. So to fix this, we're going to need the object fit property. So grab the object fit, set this to cover. If you guys want to know more about the object fit property and all its different values, I do have a 5-Minute Fridays episode if you guys want to check that out and learn more about it. Now you can see we've run into another issue here where we can't actually see the faces of the characters. So to do that, we need the object position. Set this to top. And you can see now we can see the faces of our characters. Now from here, we want to create our grid container. So we want to grab the card container class and give this a width of, let's say, 60%. And then some margin, so 0 on the left and right, so we'll just set an auto, so it's centered in the middle of the browser here. And then what I want to do is grab the display property and set this to grid, so now we can create our grid container. Now this is where the magic is going to happen, where we can make this grid layout all responsive with just one line of code. So the first thing we need to do is grab grid template columns, and then we need our first ingredient, which is the repeat function. Now the second ingredient is the auto fit property, and I'll explain what this does in just a moment. And then the last thing we need is just the min max, and this is pretty much exactly what it means. So first we set a minimum width we want the card to be, and then a maximum width. So we want the minimum width of this to be let's say 300 pixels, and then we want the maximum to be 1 fr. So if there's any available space, the cards will stretch out to fill the rest of that space instead of giving us a bit of a gap. So what this is essentially saying is that the cards have a minimum width of 300 pixels, so they can't go any smaller than this. So currently right now we can't fit another card on a new line, so they'll just stack on top of each other. And then if we get even larger and we can fit another card, the auto fit will kick in and fit in that other card. So I'll show you guys exactly what I mean. So I'll grab the browser, and if we can fit another card, you'll see now it puts another card on the line. And if we get even bigger, you can see once we can fit another card, it will put that card on a new line, and you can see now it's completely responsive. So this is what the auto fit is doing. And then exactly the same rules apply if we get smaller. So they can't go any smaller than 300 pixels. So if it can't fit that card, it will drop down into a new line. And then if it can't fit even 2 cards and it can only fit 1, because it can't get any smaller than 300 pixels, it will just stack them on top of each other. And you see there that I need to put a bit of a gap between them, so we're just going to say 20 pixels. So I'm just going to show you guys that again. You'll see now there's a bit of a gap between the cards. So you can see now it's completely responsive with just one line of code. So if we get bigger, it will fit more cards. If it gets smaller, they'll just stack on top of each other. And as you can see, we've done this all on just one line. Now I do have a 5-Minute Fridays episode, which goes a lot more in depth about all of this, if you guys want to check that out. But this is essentially how this works. And there's also another value called autofill. So again, if you want to learn more about that, check out that 5-Minute Fridays episode. Now from here, we want to start styling the cards and applying Flexbox. So we're going to go underneath the card container, grab the class of card, and the first thing I want to do is just give this a background color. So it's going to be an RGBA value of like a sort of light gray. So we're going to have 255, 255 for the blue, green and red, and then one more 255, and then the last is the alpha, and this is going to be for the opacity, so say 0.2. And just get rid of all that text. So you can see now it has a almost a transparent grey background. And then the next thing I want to do is just apply a box shadow to this. So I'm going to say 0 on the X and Y, and then 5 pixel blur, so it goes all the way around the card, and also apply an RGBA value here for the color. So this one is going to be dark, or pretty much black, so 0, 0 for the red, green and blue. And then for the alpha, we can say 0.1, and just get rid of all that text again. So it's really faint, but there is a box shadow around the cards. And the next thing I'm going to do, if we look at our original example, you can see it slightly jolts up and you can see more of the box shadow. So we're going to apply a transition here. So we're going to grab the transition property, grab the all, say 0.2 seconds, and then ease in, and then give this a position of relative. So we now going to go and create the hover effect. So grab the card again, apply a hover class, and say top, let's say -2 pixels. And then for the box shadow, we're going to say 0 on the X, about 4 pixels on the Y, and then 5 pixel blur again. And then again applying that RGBA value. So just going to grab that and paste it in here. And what this should do now is give us a nice little hover effect, which jolts the card up and also shows the box shadow. So as you can see it there, even though the box shadow is really faint, it is there. So that's it for the CSS Grid layout. Now we can use Flexbox to style the inside of the card, so the image and the text. And we have a couple of options here. So I'm just going to go inside the card again, and I'm going to set a display to flex. So initially it'll put all the content in a row, so it'll have the image and then the text afterwards. But I don't actually want them like this. In the original, you can see the content actually stacks on top of each other. You could style it like this and then apply some alignment properties to put the text more central, and then apply some styling to the text to give it some padding. But again, this is not how I want to style it. I want to put them on top of each other. So we do that with the flex direction, say column, and now we'll put them on top of each other. And then what I want to do is just set the align items to the center, and then just make sure the text is aligned to the center as well. And as you can see with Flexbox for the smaller layouts, you see it's much more convenient. So if we want to put the items on top of each other, like I have here, we can set the flex direction to column. And if we want them to appear side by side in a row, you can see we just remove the column, and then we could just apply some styles here. And as you can see, what the align items has done is just placed all our content to the center here horizontally. And again, I want them to stack on top of each other, so I'm just going to uncomment that out. And then what you can do from here is I'm just going to change the color of the text to white, same as the original. And then we can come underneath here and then grab the card, say H2. You guys can style this however you want. We can increase the font size. So let's say about 20 pixels. No, let's say about 30 pixels actually. So make that a bit bigger. We can add some margin here, about 5 pixels to give it some more space. We can do the same with the paragraphs. So we grab the card P, and let's just give this some margin as well of, let's say, about 5 pixels too. See what that looks like. You can see now. It's starting to look like the original here. Of course, the styling here is a bit different, but you guys can style this however you like. So again, guys, you can see how much more convenient it is to use both Flexbox and CSS Grid to lay this all out. We've created a bunch of bio cards for our Mortal Kombat characters, and on the larger scale, we've laid it out and made it responsive using CSS Grid with just one line of code. Now, the first rule of thumb we just looked at is true in most cases. So if something's on a smaller scale, use Flexbox, and if something's on a larger scale and more complex, use CSS Grid. Again, this does ring true most of the time, but we shouldn't limit ourselves to this kind of thinking. We should actually probably avoid this, because there are a lot of cases where we could use CSS Grid on the smaller scale, which is more convenient, and there are cases where you could use Flexbox on the larger scale, which can actually be more convenient as well. So let's dive into VS Code and just look at a simple example. So for this example, guys, I'm going to show how using Flexbox on the smaller scale isn't always the best and cleanest option, and how this actually ties into the second rule of thumb. So inside VS Code here, we've got a flex container and a grid container, and inside each of these containers we have 3 divs inside which act as our items. So first I'm going to be using Flexbox to lay out the content in a typical use case of when you might use Flexbox to create something, so something like a nav bar. So we'll head inside the style sheet, grab the flex container or the class of flex, and what I'm going to do is set a display here to flex. And immediately you'll see our items now are in a row, and then from here I just want to add a justify content, so let's just give them some space around so they're nice and spread out. And what I want to do is just give the items an equal space across the whole of the container. So to do that, we need to grab the items. So they got item 1 and give this a flex of 1. So it's like a relative unit. And you can see this automatically fills up all the available space. So we want to make them equal. So we're going to duplicate that. And then for the second and third, we're going to apply a relative unit of 1 here. And as you can see now, they're taking up all the available space left inside the container. And then from here, we can do all sorts of things. So let's just say we wanted the second one to be bigger than the first one, and then the third one to be bigger than the second and the first one. So all we need to do is change the value here to 2. So now this will be double the size of 1 and 3. And then let's just say for the third one, we want it to give it a flex of 3. So now it's the same size as 1 and 2 combined. And what I'm going to do is actually also give them a bit of gap here to demonstrate the gap properties for flex. So we'll say gap, let's say about 10 pixels. And as you can see now, we've created a flex container and we have control of how we lay the items out inside this flex container, which is great. But let's do the exact same thing with CSS Grid. So with this section here, so we're going to go underneath flex, grab grid, and we'll set a display of grid. And then to create that, we're going to use grid template columns. We're going to say 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. So 1FR represents 1 column. And let's also add a gap here. So gap of about 10 pixels. And then let's just create the same thing. So we want the second to be bigger than the first. And then we want the third to be the first and second combined. So what we need to do in here is go inside the second column, say 2FR. And then for the third one, say 3FR. So as you can see, we have the exact same layout, but just a quick inspection of this, you can see that for Flex, we need all these lines of code here, whereas for Grid, all we need is this one line to change the layout. Whereas with Flexbox, as you can see, if we wanted to change the width of all the Flex items, we have to go into the individual class to change things around. So as you can see, it's not always the case that Flexbox is perfect for smaller scales. Now conversely, CSS Grid isn't actually always applied to large scales, because if we take a look at Bootstrap, which is a CSS framework which is quite popular, you can see the grid system on Bootstrap actually uses Flexbox. So again, it isn't always the case to use CSS Grid for large scale layouts. And as I mentioned, this actually ties into the second rule of thumb. So the second rule of thumb is that when the content shapes the layout, use Flexbox. When the layout shapes the content, use CSS Grid. So to show you guys what I mean, I'm just going to get rid of this code here, and I'm just going to make the columns on the grid all the same length, so 1 fractional unit. So if we go inside the index file here, and I'm going to go inside the flex container and go inside the first item, and I'm just going to put a dummy text in here of 10. You can see here that the content is actually shaping the width of the first container. So this is what I mean when the content shapes the layout, use Flexbox, because the content of the text here is shaping the width of the flex container. Whereas for the grid, if I add the same amount of dummy text inside the first item, you can see the columns aren't changing in width and the content is actually being shaped by the layout. So this is when you'd use CSS Grid. So that's essentially the second rule of thumb. So when the content shapes the layout, use Flexbox, and when the layout shapes the content, use CSS Grid. So that'll be it for the video, guys. And as I mentioned throughout the tutorial, it's best practice to use Flexbox and CSS Grid in conjunction, meaning that it's much better to use them together to achieve the maximum results in your projects. Now, if you guys enjoyed the content, please show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel, and I'll see you guys next time.